Nonprofit leaders and managers, if you haven't already started, you're thinking about 2024 and planning ahead, it's a great time to get started. In this video, I'm going to talk us through a checklist of things that you should be thinking through to plan ahead for the next year, as well as provide some tips and tools and strategies to help you get ahead of the game. Welcome back. My name is Amber Melanie Smith, and I'm a nonprofit founder and social entrepreneur. And I make these videos here on YouTube to help other folks who want to make an impact but might need a little help and guidance getting started on your journey. Feel free to check out so many other videos I have on this channel all about things like starting a nonprofit, fundraising, social entrepreneurship, social impact leadership, and more. And don't forget to also subscribe to my newsletter linked below this video for more tips and strategies and opportunities that I come across and want to share with you all. Finally, if you're looking for some online trainings about starting a nonprofit or developing a fundraising plan, check out my website, foundertofulltime.com. All right, let's get started. All right, it's that time of year where it's a great idea to be planning ahead and thinking through your strategy for all sorts of things to make sure your nonprofit is going to not just sustain, but thrive in the year ahead. There are lots of things that nonprofit leaders need to consider, well, year round, but especially in planning for the next year. But in this video, we're going to talk about some items in about 5 different bucket areas. And those 5 areas are budget, fundraising, programming, board of directors, and strategy. All right, number 1 is budget planning. So let's get into a little bit of this. The first thing is hopefully you're doing this year round, at least quarterly, but ideally even closer to monthly, especially if you're a smaller or newer organization who's still figuring out a lot of your fundraising and financial cadence. But the first thing you need to do is really assess your financial statements and get a picture of the financial health of your organization. This is something that's often done at every board meeting, often presented by your board treasurer and aided by tools like accounting software that can kind of spit out reports for you to show you how you're doing. So as you're going through and looking at your financial statements and assessing the financial health of your organization, your goal is really to figure out if you're going to be operating with a surplus or at a deficit, and thinking through questions like, how much more are you going to be spending this year and bringing in through your fundraising efforts this year? You really want to arrive at the answer to the question, what is your bank balance going to be at the start of the new year? Now, we're using 2024 and the new year as sort of a milestone, but I do understand that different nonprofits might have different fiscal years, some that might start in the summer or the fall. And I talk a lot about that in one of my other videos on budgeting that you can definitely check out. But knowing the clear answers to how much money you're going to have in your bank account at the start of the year is going to help you project into 2024 or the year ahead. More specifically, this information is going to help you and your board build out your next year's budget, which is of course something your board needs to be doing every year and voting and approving on that budget before the next fiscal year comes up. So when you have your data in place, you know what you're spending each month, you can see, your routines, your trends, etc., you're going to be able to project your income and your expenses into the next year. I would start with your expenses, and I talked about this in past videos about budgeting as well, but you need to know what you need to spend money on so that you know how much you're going to need to raise in order to cover all those expenses. So if you start with your expenses, you are taking a look at what you spent the past year. You're thinking about your programmatic and strategic goals for the year ahead, how many more people you want to serve, for example, what special investments might you need to make in your programming or operations in order to grow your impact in the next year, or at the very least sustain your impact. Doing the research on pricing, understanding what everything on your expense list is going to cost in the next year. We know prices are rising, so you can't necessarily count on everything costing the same amount as it did in the year before. So that's how you develop your expense list. And once you have the total of the amount of money that you project you're going to need to spend for the next year, you can come up with a fundraising strategy to figure out how you're going to raise all the money needed to pay for all those expenses. The fundraising strategy can mirror the expense strategy in the sense that you can take a look at the successes you had in fundraising the year before and project what successes you think you're going to have in the year ahead. Then you'll see if there's a gap. If you don't think you're going to raise enough using your same strategies, then you need to be thinking about what new strategies can you try out to bring in more revenue. Okay, so when you're first starting this whole budget thought process, who do you need at the table? My recommendation is you need a couple of board members, specifically your treasurer and maybe some of your top officers, or if you have a finance committee, obviously they would be involved. And if you have staff, you need them at the table too, because they are on the ground. They are the ones who are using the things that you are buying with the money that you are raising. So you need to hear from them what would make their lives and their efforts easier in terms of executing on your nonprofit's very important social mission, and make sure those things are getting into the budget. So it's a conversation with all of these different stakeholders as you are doing the research and compiling the list of things you're going to need to spend money on, as well as how you and your team are going to raise the money to cover the costs for all of those expenses. I think that including all these people in your budgeting process really creates a great sense of buy-in, and a team that budgets together stays on budget together. Thing number 2 that you need to be doing some thinking around for the year ahead is your fundraising strategy. And I wanted to list this second because it goes hand in hand with your budgeting strategy, as I alluded to in the last section. So you really should be developing your fundraising strategy simultaneously to developing your budget for the next year. And as I was saying before, how you want to start this process is by really getting clear on what has been working from a fundraising perspective in the year before. I've talked about in several other videos the many different ways that nonprofits bring in revenue and fundraise. Everything from individual donors to grants and corporate sponsorships, events, and earned income. So there are lots of different ways, and every nonprofit is going to be doing this a little bit differently. But if you're doing any or multiple of these ways, you want to study them. You want to figure out what has been the most effective, what has had the greatest ROI. So what I mean by that is not just how much money have you raised through a particular pathway, but how does the money raised compare to the time and effort or other money you invested in order to get that return on investment? Obviously, the dream is to spend the least amount of time and effort possible to yield the highest amount of money. So you want to be looking and possibly ranking the different things that you're doing in that sort of way. If you have a fundraising event that's bringing in $50,000, but it's costing you 9 months of staff time to plan, that might not be the greatest return on investment after all. So after you get a sense of some of the most successful or effective mechanisms for fundraising and revenue generation for your organization, you want to actually sit down with your team. This can be your board and your staff, or just your board if you don't have staff, and literally brainstorm fundraising prospects to put on your list of potential donors or corporate sponsors or grantors for the following year. You want to think to yourself, who has a reasonable chance of giving us money next year, and how much do we think that they would give us? This exercise forces you to think through the realisticness of your fundraising strategy, because if you think that you're going to bring in all the money you need through individual donors, but you and your board can't actually list enough individual donors who would donate enough next year to cover that, then you might just be making some assumptions about your situation that might not be actually true. So as a recap, you're going to list the actual prospects that you have for fundraising, who might donate as an individual, what companies might sponsor, what grants you might get. You're going to list them all out, and then you're going to put next to them on a spreadsheet or some document the probability of you getting each one of those. That will help you and your board paint a super clear picture of the money that you can expect to come in the next year, and where the gaps are, how much more you're going to need to raise or find new opportunities to raise money for. Once you have all these prospects written out, you want to to kind of create a timeline for your year ahead. When are you going to focus your attention on each of these fundraising mechanisms? What types of planning will be involved? What types of support or help are you going to need for each one of them? If you have a major event at one point in the year, when is that going to be? And how are you going to balance out your other fundraising initiatives around that so that you're not exhausting your donor base? Of course, we also know sometimes grant opportunities or sponsorship opportunities have deadlines for when to apply. So you want to map out those deadlines on your fundraising timeline for the next year also, so that you can be sure to stay on schedule. As a final thought on fundraising, as you're going through and assessing the effectiveness of each of your fundraising streams, really think about if your organization has a need to further diversify their revenue strategy. I've seen organizations who put all of their eggs in one basket, so to speak, and then something happened to the economy or to their community or their city that made it impossible to continue getting funding from that specific source. For example, foundation grants, might have been on the decline during some parts of the pandemic. So just, thinking through some of the external factors that are going to impact your fundraising strategy and what contingency plans can you develop to make sure you're covered if something like that happens. All right, the third bucket of planning that we're going to talk about is programming and program evaluation. Hopefully throughout the year, you are keeping an eye on the impacts that you're making through your programming, but it's really important to especially do this and look at the data that you have been able to collect around the success of your programs when you're doing your budgeting and fundraising planning for the next year, because everything is interconnected. You really want to make sure that you are effective in your programming. That's your whole mission as an organization, is to make a difference for people and for your community. So if you're not measuring the results of that and taking a moment to look at those results every once in a while, how do you know if you're making an impact? I will say, if you are a new organization or a newer organization, if you haven't set up some systems and mechanisms for evaluating the success of your program yet, now is a really good time to put those things in place. That way you can have an entire next year worth of data, and that means that the year after that you have all of this data that you can build on and showcase to funders and donors, etc. When you are thinking about how to measure whether your program is making an impact and it is successful, the first thing you want to think about are what are the outputs and the outcomes of the program that you really want to focus in on. And what I mean by that is what changes occur in the lives of others as a result of interacting with your program. Is it a certain number of people are fed? Is it that a certain number of people receive housing and escape homelessness? Is it that the people who participate in your job training program have a 60% higher likelihood of getting a job than people who don't participate in your job training program? You want to be thinking through, what are the measures of success? What, at the end of the day, does it look like for your organization to have achieved its mission? So to recap, what are you trying to succeed at? Is it a certain number of people reached, and reached in what ways? Is it a certain percent of a transformation from one state to another state? A certain percent of trees salvaged from being cut down? In terms of how to collect this data, you have a lot of options. You can do surveys of the people that you're serving, or surveys that ask your community stakeholders what they think about your mission. You can track the literal number of people served. If you're doing something like providing meals or direct services like that, just count how many people you're helping, and in what ways. And then that's the quantitative impact and outputs. The qualitative would be more like their testimonials of how your services have changed their lives. Always be collecting this data and using those mechanisms like survey tools or testimonials to make sure that you have all that data accessible to you and your team. So let's say you've got this data, you want to be sitting down with your team regularly again, just like you would assess the financial health of your organization. I recommend assessing the programmatic impacts of your organization at least quarterly, but at the very least doing it before you're planning for the year ahead. Sit down with your team, Make sure you've collected all your data in one place and that it is accurate. And then take a look at it with an honest eye. What is your organization really exceeding in? What are some areas of weakness or areas for improvement that you could do better in terms of serving your community? Look at these things with your team and brainstorm what you would need in terms of resources or training or additional support or help, what you would need in order to improve on the top 1 or 2 things that you've decided you want to improve on as a team. And then those things should go into your budget. One aspect of this is, of course, as I said, assessing what's working really well and deciding if the thing that's working really well is something you want to scale up and grow next year. But another harder part of this is thinking about what's not working and if it's worthwhile to continue doing something if it's not working. And I don't mean continuing with the whole organization. What I'm saying is if there's some aspect of your program that you tried out and it's really not having results, really being honest with yourselves as a team to determine if it's something that's worthwhile continuing to try or improve upon, or if it's better to try focusing on strategies that are working really well instead. All right, let's get into area number 4, and that is board of directors development. Ideally, your board of directors should be improving and getting more and more effective every single year of your organization. So having a board assessment or board evaluation mechanism can help you set a baseline to measure that effectiveness year over year. A board evaluation or board assessment document is a great tool to help the board measure its own skills, engagement, meaning how are they participating in the organization and its activities, and their contributions to the organization as well. So a couple months before the end of the year, right before your next year, is a perfect time to do this so that you have a baseline for the next year. There are lots of great templates and tools that you can find online for board assessments if you don't have one already. But let's just talk through a couple things that your board assessment should ask or have on them in order to get at the information that's going to be the most useful for you. The questions that go on your board assessment are going to help identify gaps in skills, knowledge, clarity of understanding, etc. And with the answers, you're going to be able to determine, oh, we need more board training in this particular area over here because a lot of people don't seem to understand this part. Or you're going to notice that maybe you don't have a specific skill set that you really need on your board of directors at all. So next time you go to recruit candidates, you know that you're looking for someone with a very specific skill set. Okay, so in terms of what content goes on this board assessment, you want to ask about a board member's knowledge and understanding of the mission and the issue that the nonprofit is tackling on the survey. So you could ask them to explain your mission in your own words. You could ask them information or maybe even, I don't know, like trivia questions about the issue that you're tackling. And you're really trying to get a sense of how educated are your board members on the mission and cause that your organization is addressing. Do board members understand their legal responsibilities? Because they have some legal responsibilities. You could ask them questions about what they would do in a specific situation that could involve a conflict of interest, or ask them to do a true or false or multiple choice question to showcase their knowledge about different legal aspects or fiduciary responsibilities of the board of directors. And for the engagement piece, are all board members actively participating in the organization and especially in fundraising? You can probably assess this just by looking at how many board members have donated to the organization in the past year, or have launched their own fundraising campaigns, or have facilitated connections to grantors or sponsors or other places that might be providing revenue for your organization. So how are they participating? Now, this topic can be a little sensitive to some people because it's just a fact that people are nervous and afraid of fundraising, and we need to do what we can to make sure people feel more comfortable with it, because It's just something that nonprofits need in order to succeed, is money. So getting your board very comfortable with fundraising might look like having one-on-one conversations with each board member to ask them about their feelings on fundraising for the organization, their comfort level, what are some of the barriers they might feel they are experiencing, or what types of things might help them feel more engaged in the fundraising process for your organization. All right, so once the assessment is done, you and your board should look at the results and identify the trends and patterns and gaps. Once you know the gaps, meaning perhaps more education is needed on a particular topic, or you have a missing skill that would be really useful for the board, or perhaps you discover that your board is not feeling engaged because of something over here. You can use that information to set goals for developing your board of directors for the following year. Making sure that all board members are clear on their responsibilities as board members and are feeling really confident and excited and engaged can really help your organization. So a couple things you might consider as you're planning ahead for the next year on how to take the information from the assessment and develop a plan to support your board's growth and development in the next year. You might consider hosting a refresher training at the beginning of the year. So just a recap of all the things like your bylaws, the board's legal responsibilities, fundraising goals, all of that stuff. Your board really needs to be knowledgeable about the finances, the program impacts, the operational activities of your organization. They need to have a baseline understanding of those things. Another strategy you might consider is having each board member sign a board member agreement that asks them to read through in writing the list of their responsibilities and the commitments they're making as board members. Everything from I understand my legal responsibility about blank to I pledge to commit 10 hours of my time per month to the organization, including meetings, etc., etc. Have them read through that and have them sign it at the bottom. That is a great way to help them sort of focus in on and make sure that they are super clear on what's expected of them, because nobody likes to sign a document that they don't understand. All right, number 5, and the last bucket we'll talk about in this video is strategic planning. This is your big picture, bird's eye view roadmap of how your organization is ultimately going to work to achieve its mission, what you have in your mission statement. So if you already have one, consider at minimum an annual review of that strategic plan and look at it with a really critical eye and ask yourself what's working, what might have changed in the external environment that is now impacting this plan and might force us to change some of these things ourselves. What is, relevant, what's not working, what do we need to change, etc. If you don't yet have a strategic plan, it's a great time to start one so that you can build out that roadmap for the couple of years ahead. A strategic plan is often a document that is designed to cover a couple year period. And because we in the nonprofit world know that things can change on a dime and affect our operations very quickly, it's meant to be a guide, but not a tactical day-to-day plan. So this strategic plan, if you don't have it already, you want to get your team together, board members, staff, any key stakeholders, to build it out together. And here's how you might begin doing that. When you're getting your team together and thinking through how are we going to build out our strategy to achieve our mission in the next couple of years, a great exercise is called a SWOT analysis. I go way more in depth about this in another video, all about using SWOT analyses to map out your plan for the future, so check that out. But in essence, SWOT is SWOT, and it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is a great exercise to have your team come around a table and brainstorm what they think falls in each of these categories for your organization. Strengths would be, what is your organization doing really well at? What are you known for? What are you exceedingly successful at? Weaknesses is what's not going as well. Is it that you don't have enough staff capacity? Is it that your fundraising isn't going so well? Is it that one of your programs is floundering? What are the various weaknesses? Opportunities and threats both refer to things happening externally that impact your organization's efforts. So opportunities. What opportunities exist out there in the community or the world that you could potentially capitalize on to further your mission? And threats is kind of the opposite of that. What are the external things happening in the world that might pose a threat to your organization's operations? During the pandemic, for example, many nonprofits would list COVID-19 as the biggest threat to their organization and its operations. Once you and your team have laid out your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you can choose which thing in each of those categories you might want to prioritize to guide your actions for the next year or two. If you've determined that your organization's doing really well in this one strength, maybe you determine it's the best strategy to double down on that one thing. If that's true, what resources or talent or training or equipment are you going to need in order to double down on that thing that you've decided to scale up? And of course, that affects your programming, it affects your board of directors development, and it affects your budget, which then in turn affects your fundraising. The priorities that you've identified through this process, those are what go on your strategic plan. Then you can map out specific goals, those outputs and those outcomes we talked about before when we were talking about programming. You can map those out for each of the priorities that you've established on your strategic plan. And you can develop a timeline. So in order to reach this goal, how long do we think that will take? And what sorts of resources are needed to reach this goal? Do we need to add a staff person? Do we need to raise $20,000 more dollars? What are the things that it's going to take to achieve that goal? And are they realistic? With timelines and goals and outputs and outcomes in place, you can determine which team members are responsible for achieving which goals. And then, boom, you have a strategic plan that can guide your couple of years ahead. By keeping an eye on these things and assessing them and revamping them or creating them if you don't have it already each fall before the next year, you are really going to be monitoring the success of your organization as it grows and making sure that it can be sustainable and thrive. I'd love to hear from you. What are you doing right now to prepare for the success of either your nonprofit or social enterprise or other social impact project for 2024? Share in the comments below. As I mentioned before, if you are in the process of starting a nonprofit or developing a fundraising plan, don't be afraid to check out my website, foundertofulltime.com, where I have those online trainings and some other resources that might be able to help you out. I also have so many other videos, so be sure to check out some of the ones that I mentioned before, all about strategic planning and making your budget. I'm sure that they'll be able to give you some helpful tips. And if you're looking for more tips and resources for change makers and nonprofit and social entrepreneur leaders, don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter linked below this video and join my online community over at Facebook. It's called Change the World or Bust. We have over 5,000 people in there now, and I'm so excited to see it grow. So I hope that you too can join us there also. That's all I have for you today. Once again, I'm Amber Melanie Smith, and I will see you next time. Bye.